I stepped onto the stage ready to change how hospitals detect postpartum infections. Before I could finish my third slide, my boss stood up and publicly humiliated me in front of hundreds of doctors. What she did not realize was that a medical journal editor sat in the back row holding a data trail capable of destroying her entire reputation. That public shaming was not my ruin, but the exact second she began digging her own grave. My name is Dorothy Bishop. As a 34-year-old clinical researcher and emergency obstetrician, I knew that stepping onto the grand stage at the National Conference on Innovations in Obstetric Medicine in Dallas was supposed to be the defining moment of my career. The blinding glare of the stage lights rendered the massive audience into a sea of shadowy figures, but I could feel their collective anticipation. This was the ultimate proving ground. I was delivering the keynote presentation on a new, highly optimized protocol for the early detection of postpartum infections, specifically designed for mid-level and rural hospitals. For nearly 3 years, I had sacrificed everything for this exact moment. I had endured countless back-to-back night shifts, surviving on stale break-room coffee and a stubborn refusal to accept a broken system. I had manually processed thousands of patient files, tracking the devastating trajectories of women who had been sent home, only to return days later in septic shock. I did not want to build another multi-million-dollar diagnostic tool that only elite, heavily funded metropolitan hospitals could afford. I wanted a gritty, functional, dirt-cheap screening model that a 2-bed rural clinic could run at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had done it. I had the data. I had the undeniable proof. I clicked the presenter remote, transitioning smoothly to my section on the initial trial results. My voice projected clearly through the massive speakers, carrying a confidence I had earned through sheer exhaustion. I explained that by combining basic inflammatory markers with heart rate variability and simplified clinical signals, our 4 collaborating centers were able to detect critical infections up to 9 hours earlier than the standard protocol. I was just drawing a breath to move to the core data visualization, the very heart of my 3 years of labor, when a sharp, violent crack echoed through the ballroom. Someone had slammed their hand against the front row control console. The feedback from the sound system shrieked in protest. I blinked through the harsh stage lights, trying to focus. Standing up from the center VIP table, perfectly illuminated by the spill of the overhead spotlight, was Dr. Simone Hart. Simone was the director of research at the Halcyon Women's Institute. She was my direct superior, the woman who controlled my lab access, my funding, and my professional future. She stood tall, her posture rigid, a microphone already clutched in her impeccably manicured hand. "I must apologize to the assembly." Simone's voice cut through the cavernous room. It was cold, precise, and amplified to a deafening volume. She did not look at the audience. Her eyes were locked dead on me. "But we cannot allow this presentation to continue under these pretenses." I froze. My thumb hovered uselessly over the remote. "Dr. Hart," I managed to say, my voice suddenly sounding small, hollowed out by the vastness of the space. "Dr. Bishop?" Simone interrupted, her tone dripping with cold, performative disappointment. "You have irresponsibly interpreted the preliminary data. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to present these findings as conclusive. Your lack of experience in handling multi-center data of this magnitude is showing, and it threatens to compromise the integrity of the Halcyon Women's Institute." The words hit me like physical blows to the chest. Irresponsibly interpreted, lack of experience, compromise the integrity. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of attendees. Then, the silence fell. It was not a respectful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that tells you a career is being destroyed in public. My mind scrambled for any rational explanation. Had I loaded the wrong file? Had a massive statistical error been caught at the last minute? I had sent her the raw data just yesterday because she demanded a final review before we traveled to Dallas. I had hesitated, knowing her long-standing reputation for absorbing the work of junior doctors. But I gave in because refusing the director of research was professional suicide. Now, every second I stood there felt like another blow to my career. Before I could formulate a defense, before I could even draw a breath to speak into my own microphone, Simone was moving. She walked up the side stairs of the stage. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the wooden floorboards in a slow, predatory cadence. She walked right up to the podium, invading my physical space, forcing me to take a panicked step back. I spent the entirety of last night repairing the methodological errors in this presentation. Simone announced into the podium microphone, effectively dismissing my existence with a wave of her hand. If the audiovisual team would be so kind as to switch the input to the main console, I will walk you through the revised, final version of the protocol. The massive screen behind me flickered. My slide vanished. A new presentation appeared. I stared up at the screen, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. It was my structure. It was my opening chart. It was the exact, painstaking central finding I had bled over for 3 years. The color scheme, the custom graphics I had built on my living room floor, the precise phrasing of the clinical summaries, it was all identically mine, except for the title slide. Right beneath the bold heading, the author credit had been cleanly, brutally altered. Lead investigator, Dr. Simone Hart. My name was entirely gone, not even relegated to a secondary researcher, just completely erased. I turned to look at her, my mouth slightly open, the betrayal so absolute and audacious that it defied human logic. Simone did not even glance my way. She was already launching into the opening notes of my speech, using my cadence, my talking points, my life's work, smoothly packaging it under her own elite brand. I looked out at the audience, the ballroom, packed with the most influential figures in my field. The people who wrote the grants and hired the department chairs had become a nightmare landscape. I saw rows upon rows of faces staring back at me. A few of them physically averted their eyes, embarrassed by the sheer brutality of what they were witnessing. Others were whispering behind their hands, nodding in agreement with Simone. And then I saw the phones. Dozens of small glowing rectangles were raised in the air. They were recording me. They were recording the exact moment Dr. Dorothy Bishop was exposed as a fraud. An incompetent junior doctor who had to be rescued by her brilliant superior. They bought the narrative completely. Why would they not? Simone Hart was a titan with a massive funding network. I was a nobody. In the brutal hierarchy of medical research, the word of a seasoned director will always crush the defense of an underling. I was standing on a stage, utterly stripped of my dignity, my work, and my future. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing my lungs, making it impossible to breathe, my vision blurred at the edges. I realized, with a sickening drop in my stomach, that I had lost. There was no argument I could make here that would not sound like the hysterical whining of a caught amateur. If I screamed, I was crazy. If I cried, I was weak. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely control my own fingers as I reached out and unplugged my laptop from the podium. Simone did not stop speaking. She merely adjusted her stance, taking up the dead center of the stage as I clutched my computer to my chest. I turned and walked away. Every step across that stage felt like walking through deep water. The silence of the crowd roared in my ears, broken only by Simone's confident voice projecting my research into the dark. I walked down the side stairs, my legs feeling like lead. I kept my head down, navigating the narrow aisle toward the heavy double doors at the back of the hall. I did not look at the grant directors. I did not look at my peers. I pushed through the heavy doors and spilled out into the brightly lit, empty corridor of the convention center. The muffled sound of Simone receiving applause for my data bled through the thick walls. I leaned against the cold plaster, clutching the laptop so hard my arms ached. I had been publicly annihilated. My career was over. The people who held the keys to my entire professional existence had just watched me get utterly dismantled. I stayed in the corridor, breathing hard and trying to think. The muffled voice of my superior echoed through the heavy mahogany doors, delivering the culmination of my existence to an enraptured audience. To understand the sheer gravity of what had just been ripped from my hands, you have to understand who I am and where that research was born. I was never the darling of the administration. I was an emergency obstetrician and a clinical researcher, known throughout our hospital corridors for an abrasive work ethic rather than any talent for flattering the executive board. My reputation was built on surviving back-to-back graveyard shifts, not navigating the delicate, political cocktail parties of the medical elite. The driving force behind my entire project was not academic glory. It was the memory of the women we lost or nearly lost. It was the haunting, metallic rhythm of the fetal monitors and the frantic rush of a code blue called at 3 a.m. I worked in a system where postpartum infections were the silent predators of the maternity ward. In massive, well-funded urban centers, they had proprietary predictive software. But out in the rural and mid-level facilities, they had nothing. They had exhausted nurses and skeleton crews. A new mother would be discharged, only to return 2 days later with a crashing blood pressure and raging sepsis, because the subtle, early warning signs had been missed in the chaos of an understaffed floor. That was the tragedy I had set out to dismantle. I did not want to invent a $20,000 diagnostic machine. I wanted to build a bulletproof, accessible lifeline. My protocol was a gritty, pragmatic hybrid. It cross-referenced a basic, $2 complete blood count with routine inflammation markers, resting heart rate curves, and simple clinical observations that any nurse could log on a clipboard. By testing this algorithm across several small, under-resourced community clinics, I proved we could flag a deadly infection 6 to 9 hours before the patient ever spiked a dangerous fever. In the world of systemic sepsis, those hours are the absolute difference between a round of antibiotics and a catastrophic organ failure. It was blue-collar science, forged in the mud of real hospital work. And it worked flawlessly. And that was exactly why Dr. Simone Hart wanted it. Simone was an entirely different breed of physician. She possessed a razor-sharp intellect, but her true genius lay in institutional survival and aggressive self-promotion. She was a master of medical public relations, boasting a labyrinthine network of pharmaceutical sponsors and deep-pocketed donors. However, within the hushed confines of the resident lounges and the sterile break rooms, her actual methodology was an open secret. Simone was an apex predator of academic credit. She had built her glittering empire by systematically absorbing the exhausting labor of the junior physicians trapped beneath her in the hospital hierarchy. We all knew the stories. A brilliant fellow would exhaust themselves running a trial, only to find Simone's name magically elevated to the primary author position upon publication, justified by some vague claim of vital supervisory guidance. I had navigated her shadow for years, keeping my head down, naively believing that the sheer, undeniable weight of my data would protect me. I thought my work was too complex, too personal, and too heavily documented for her to simply swallow whole. I was wrong. I had underestimated the brazenness of a woman who felt entirely immune to consequence. The trap had been set exactly 24 hours before the conference doors opened. I was sitting in my cramped office, finalizing the formatting on my slides, when an email from Simone arrived. It was brief, authoritative, and carried the implicit threat of her position. She demanded the transfer of the complete, raw data set and the unedited statistical appendices. The stated reason was a mandatory, final institutional compliance check before I took the national stage. I remember my hand hovering over the mouse. A cold knot of intuition had formed in my stomach. The data was my only leverage, the only tangible proof of the thousands of hours I had spent coding patient files in the dark. But the reality of academic medicine is a hostage situation. If I refused, I would instantly be branded as uncooperative, paranoid, and insubordinate. In our world, being labeled difficult by a department chair is a permanent stain that can destroy fellowship opportunities and dry up grant money overnight. I convinced myself that it was merely bureaucratic paranoia. I told myself that even Simone would not dare steal a fully completed project on the eve of a national keynote. So, prioritizing my career survival over my instincts, I attached the files, hit send, and handed her the evidence she would later use against me, standing in the desolate hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The anatomy of the ambush finally became crystal clear. The sudden interruption, the loud accusations of incompetence, the theatrical dismay. None of it was a spontaneous outburst. It was a meticulously choreographed performance. If she had simply tried to present my work as her own, there would have been questions. People would have asked why the lead researcher was suddenly sidelined. But by standing up and publicly declaring my data interpretation as reckless and amateurish, she instantly discredited me in front of the entire medical community. She flipped the narrative completely, in the eyes of the hundreds of powerful doctors sitting in that ballroom. Simone Hart was not a thief stealing a junior doctor's crowning achievement. She was a dedicated, responsible senior leader stepping in at the last possible second to rescue her institute from the disastrous mistakes of an unstable subordinate. She had not just taken my protocol. She had effectively burned my professional reputation to the ground to ensure I could never be credible enough to claim it back. She knew I would flee the stage. She knew the shock and the public shaming would paralyze me. She had counted on my silence. A suffocating wave of despair washed over me. The heavy realization settled into my bones that I had been completely outmaneuvered. I had spent 3 years fighting a war against a biological pathogen, completely blind to the human one waiting in my own department. I pulled my laptop tighter against my chest, the metal warm against my scrubs. My mind raced, searching for any possible avenue of recourse, any governing body or ethics committee I could appeal to. But the bleak reality of institutional power dynamics answered back. It was my word against the director of research, without irrefutable proof of her malicious intent. Any complaint I filed would simply look like the bitter retaliation of a junior doctor who had cracked under the pressure of a national stage. I was a ghost in my own profession, erased and overwritten, with absolutely nowhere left to run. I pushed myself off the wall, intent on escaping the convention center, retreating to my hotel room, and figuring out how to resign quietly before the institute formally terminated me. I took one step toward the exit, my career effectively reduced to ashes. I was halfway to the revolving glass doors, my hand reaching for the polished brass handle to escape into the sweltering Texas heat, when the sharp vibration in my scrub pocket broke my trance. I almost ignored it. My immediate instinct was to keep moving, to flee the scene of my professional execution and hide in the sterile anonymity of my hotel room until my return flight the next morning. But the vibration persisted. A second, urgent pulse against my hip that demanded acknowledgement. I pulled out my phone. The screen displayed a single, glowing message from an entirely unfamiliar number. The text was brief, devoid of any pleasantries, and possessed a chilling certainty that stopped me dead in my tracks. Do not leave the building. You are being pushed out of your own research. Meet me in the West Corridor. Now. The West Corridor of the convention center was a stark, jarring contrast to the bustling, opulent main halls. It was a utilitarian artery, lined with heavy service elevators and tall stacks of folded metal chairs, draped in heavy shadows away from the glamorous chandeliers of the main promenade. The distant, muffled applause from the ballroom felt like a different universe. My footsteps echoed sharply against the bare concrete floor as I turned the corner, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A man was waiting by the emergency exit signs. He was tall, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that seemed out of place among the sea of standard, slightly rumpled medical conference attire. He possessed a terrifying stillness, an aura of absolute control that commanded immediate attention. As I approached cautiously, he did not offer his hand in greeting. Instead, he reached into his worn leather briefcase and extracted a slim, silver tablet. "Dr. Bishop," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the steady hum of the overhead ventilation units. "I am Dr. Elias Voss. I serve as the editor-in-chief for the Meridian Review of Clinical Medicine." The name sent a sudden, sharp jolt through my exhausted system. The Meridian was one of the most prestigious, fiercely competitive peer-reviewed medical journals in the hemisphere. Exactly 6 months ago, I had submitted the foundational manuscript of my protocol to their editorial board, praying for a minor revision request, only to hear absolute, agonizing silence. "You submitted a rather compelling piece of literature to my editorial board half a year ago," Elias continued, his face betraying no emotion as he tapped the screen of his device to wake it. "I brought it with me to Dallas today because I anticipated a discrepancy. What I did not anticipate was watching a public slaughter in the main auditorium." He turned the screen toward me, holding it up so the harsh fluorescent light did not cause a glare. The display was split vertically into 2 distinct document viewer windows. "Take a very close look," he instructed, his tone entirely devoid of warmth, offering only pure, clinical observation. On the left side of the screen was my original, painstaking manuscript. I recognized the specific serif font, the exact spacing of the abstract, the way I always uniquely indented my methodology subheadings. The submission date stamped clearly at the top right corner read exactly 6 months prior. My name sat proudly beneath the main title. Then, I shifted my focus to the document occupying the right side of the screen. It was the exact same title, the exact same opening abstract. But the submission date was stamped a mere 3 weeks ago, and the sole author listed at the top was Dr. Simone Hart. My eyes darted rapidly between the 2 texts, searching for any meaningful deviation. There was none. The duplication was not merely thematic or loosely inspired, it was a verbatim, aggressive replication. The structural flow, the dense data tables, the precise wording of the footnotes, even the specific, slightly awkward phrasing I had used to describe the inflammatory marker variables, it was all perfectly cloned. I have a terrible habit of double spacing after semicolons in my methodology breakdowns, a bizarre formatting tic my residency advisor used to mock me for relentlessly. There it was, sitting proudly in Simone's supposed final version. "She stole it," I whispered, the crushing reality of the theft solidifying from a horrifying suspicion into a coldly documented fact. "She just submitted it under her own name." Elias shook his head slightly, a dark, cynical glint flashing in his eyes. "Plagiarism is a mundane sin in our academic world, Dr. Bishop. It is the dirty, quiet engine of institutional advancement. If this were merely a case of stolen authorship, I would have quietly rejected her submission, sent a harshly worded letter to her department chair, and permanently blacklisted her from my journal. But the reality of what we are looking at is far more severe. The theft of your words is merely the appetizer. The main course is a massive violation of scientific integrity." He swiped his index finger across the glass, minimizing the text documents and pulling up a deeply complex spreadsheet filled with raw statistical outputs. "When Dr. Hart submitted her version 3 weeks ago, our automated pre-screening software immediately flagged a 98% match with your dormant file," Elias explained, his voice dropping a full octave in the empty hallway. "That alert triggered a mandatory manual review. I personally ran her supplementary statistical appendices through our forensic integrity algorithms. These are highly sophisticated diagnostic programs designed to detect impossible numerical distributions, the kind of synthetic perfection that only happens when a human hand tries to mimic biological randomness." He tapped a specific column that was highlighted in glaring, undeniable red. "Your original submission contained a perfectly natural, somewhat messy dataset, exactly as real clinical trials always do. Dr. Hart's version is aggressively pristine. Our software indicated that the supplementary files in her manuscript show distinct, undeniable markers of manual tampering. Someone went into the raw spreadsheet cells and artificially smoothed out the variance. They erased the messy, inconclusive outliers, and tightened the standard deviation to make the protocol appear flawlessly effective across all patient demographics. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Manipulating raw clinical data was not just unethical, it was a career-ending, potentially criminal act. It meant pushing a medical protocol into active hospitals based on a fabricated lie. Look closely at the recruitment timelines for the external validation phase, Elias commanded, pointing a long, steady finger at a cluster of dates near the bottom of the screen. I leaned in, my rigid clinical training instantly overriding my personal shock. I scanned the patient enrollment logs for the third collaborating center, a tiny, underfunded rural clinic near the state border. According to Simone's submitted data, they had successfully enrolled their first 12 patients during the first week of February. They even recorded comprehensive inflammatory panels for those specific individuals. That is chronologically impossible, I stated, my voice suddenly hardening into stone. That specific facility did not even receive their Institutional Review Board approval code until the final week of April. They could not legally recruit a single patient, let alone draw their blood for a trial. In February. I know this for an absolute fact because I spent 2 entire weeks fighting on the phone with their compliance officer just to get that code generated. Exactly, Elias said, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. She did not just steal your architecture, she blatantly fabricated a significant portion of the validating data to guarantee a lucrative publication and secure immediate commercial funding here today. The air in the corridor felt suddenly thin, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked into the ventilation grates. Why are you showing me this? I asked, the sheer sprawling magnitude of the conspiracy making my hands tremble again. If you have the proof, why did you not just expose her yourself from the back of the room? Because she is a deeply entrenched, highly protected parasite. And I have been hunting her for half a decade, Elias replied, his voice laced with a cold, meticulously controlled fury. I have suspected Dr. Hart for years. She possesses a distinct, highly recognizable, and deeply toxic pattern of behavior. A brilliant junior resident mysteriously vanishes from a promising project, and her name miraculously appears as the primary author just before publication. I have watched her consume the careers of 3 different young scientists, but I never had the definitive, undeniable proof required to sever her from her massive funding network. The victims were always too terrified of retaliation to speak, and the data was always just plausible enough to pass a standard editorial review. He closed the tablet cover, the sharp magnetic click echoing loudly in the empty hall. Until today, he continued, until she became so wildly arrogant, so utterly convinced of her own absolute invulnerability, that she stole an active, time-stamped manuscript straight from my servers and injected it with impossible, fabricated dates. He took a deliberate step closer to me, the shadows of the corridor masking half his face, turning him into an executioner. This is no longer a petty departmental dispute over who gets to stand at a podium, Dr. Bishop. This is a massive, systemic data fraud. She is currently on that stage selling a scientifically compromised medical protocol to hundreds of hospital directors. If you walk out those glass doors and board a plane, she wins everything, and real patients will eventually suffer the devastating consequences of her altered statistics. But if we can definitively prove this manual tampering before the conference concludes, we do not just win back your title. Her entire academic empire collapses today. Every paper she has ever published will be rigorously audited. Her funding will evaporate. She will be permanently stripped of her license. I stood completely frozen, the immense weight of his words pressing down on my shoulders. 30 minutes ago, I was a defeated, humiliated victim looking for an emergency exit. Now, I was holding the key to the total destruction of the woman who had just tried to ruin my life. The profound anger, which had been completely smothered by shock and public humiliation, finally ignited in my chest. It was a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear anger. Elias and I slipped back into the cavernous auditorium, just as the ambient lighting shifted. The massive screen above the main stage now displayed the complex scatter plots I had agonizingly constructed to map out the multi-center external validation phase. Simone stood at the absolute center of the stage, wielding a green laser pointer with practiced, arrogant elegance. She was commanding the room, projecting absolute authority, soaking in the collective admiration of her peers. But as we silently took our seats in the heavily shadowed back row, the entire dynamic of the room began to shift. The formal presentation had concluded, and the open question and answer segment had officially begun. A tall, sharp-featured infectious disease specialist approached the microphone stand positioned in the center aisle. He adjusted his glasses, looking intently at the massive display. "Dr. Hart," he began, his tone respectful but probing. "Looking at your inflammatory markers, your chosen thresholds for C-reactive protein and serum lactate deviate significantly from the established gold standard guidelines. Could you walk us through the specific pharmacokinetic rationale for lowering those exact cutoffs?" Simone did not miss a beat. She offered a polished, magnanimous smile that was designed to disarm. "An excellent question," she purred into her lapel microphone, her voice echoing smoothly across the hall. "In shifting away from rigid historical models, our team optimized the thresholds according to real-time clinical signals. We allowed the practical realities of the ward to dictate the parameters rather than relying entirely on textbook averages." It sounded brilliantly progressive to a layman or a hospital administrator, but to anyone intimately familiar with the biochemical mechanics of sepsis, it was nothing but empty, corporate air. She had entirely dodged the core of the question. She did not know that the lowered lactate threshold was specifically calibrated to account for the delayed metabolic clearance rates that are uniquely typical in immediate postpartum physiology. She just recited a generic academic buzzword phrase because she possessed zero understanding of the biological reality beneath the numbers. Before the specialist could politely press for a genuine clinical answer, a highly regarded medical statistician from a prominent East Coast university took the opposite aisle microphone. "Dr. Hart, regarding the rural patient cohorts," she said, her voice dry, fast, and fiercely analytical. "Community clinics notoriously suffer from incomplete patient logging due to severe understaffing. What was your exact rate of missing data points in those specific rural subsets? And what imputation method did you use to fill those longitudinal gaps?" "We applied a standardized calibration," Simone answered smoothly, waving her hand casually as if dismissing a minor, irrelevant clerical detail. All localized discrepancies were effectively adjusted to match the overall statistical power of the primary data pool. I gripped the armrest of my chair so tightly my knuckles ached. Standardized calibration was a completely fabricated, meaningless phrase in this specific context. The rural data was incredibly messy, precisely because the nurses were too busy keeping hemorrhaging women alive to log every single hourly temperature check. To build the model, I had utilized a highly specific multiple imputation technique based on chained equations to carefully account for those missing variables without skewing the reality. Simone had absolutely no idea what that process entailed. She was speaking with complete confidence about a process she clearly did not understand. She was simply reading my polished conclusions while drowning in the methodology. The real trap, however, began to close when a seasoned, deeply tanned obstetrician from Texas stepped up to the center microphone. "I run a mid-sized facility down south," he said, leaning heavily against the metal stand. "I am looking at your readmission tables for the second collaborative center. According to this chart, they maintained a 0% readmission rate for postpartum infections straight through the absolute peak of the winter flu season. With the critical staffing shortages we all face across the board, maintaining a flat 0% during those chaotic months is statistically miraculous." How exactly did they achieve that flawless record? For the very first time since she stole my podium, the flawless veneer cracked. Simone's green laser pointer wavered wildly off the screen, dancing across the dark curtains. The muscles in her jaw tightened visibly, and her meticulously practiced, benevolent smile vanished for exactly half a second. She quickly recovered, shifting her weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. That particular facility maintained exceptional, rigorous adherence to our new alert protocol, she stated, her voice suddenly slightly higher and much tighter than before. The 0% figure reflects their outstanding localized implementation. She was lying entirely on the fly. The mundane truth was that the specific Texas facility had temporarily suspended all maternal intake for 3 weeks in January due to a catastrophic plumbing failure in their maternity wing. That closure artificially drove their infection readmission numbers to 0, simply because there were no patients to readmit. It was a vital, clarifying footnote I had explicitly detailed in my original appendix. It was an appendix she had clearly skimmed and then manually smoothed out to make the presentation look aggressively, perfectly successful to potential financial sponsors. Then, the man sitting right next to me stood up. Elias Voss did not walk down the aisle to join the line at the stationary microphones. He simply stood tall in the back row, his imposing figure catching the immediate attention of the audiovisual crew. A panicked runner quickly sprinted up the carpeted stairs and handed him a wireless microphone. The sprawling auditorium fell into a sudden, incredibly tense quiet. Hundreds of heads swiveled backward. Everyone in that room recognized the editor-in-chief of the most influential medical journal on the continent. "Dr. Hart," Elias began, his deep, gravelly voice commanding the entire room without an ounce of forced effort. "I find your external validation timeline absolutely fascinating. I am currently looking at the recruitment logs you just highlighted for your 4th collaborating facility." Simone gripped the polished wooden edges of the podium, her knuckles turning bone white. "Yes, Dr. Voss, what is your question?" "According to your presentation, that specific rural center began enrolling their first cohort of patients in early February," Elias stated, his tone deliberately slow, methodical, and dangerously clear. "However, institutional review board records are entirely public domain. The specific research code required for that facility to legally and ethically recruit human subjects was not approved and officially issued until late April. Could you please explain to this esteemed assembly how your research team was actively recruiting patients, drawing their blood, and running complex inflammatory panels 2.5 months before it was legally permissible to even approach them?" The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of an academic presentation. It was the sharp, suffocating, terrifying silence of a room witnessing a fatal, high-speed collision. A low murmur began to ripple through the front rows. It rapidly swelled into a chaotic, undeniable buzzing. People leaned over the tables to whisper urgently to their colleagues. I watched the infectious disease specialist pull out his smartphone, undoubtedly searching the federal ethics databases right then and there. On the brilliantly lit stage, Simone Hart was utterly stranded. The theatrical, overwhelming command she had weaponized against me less than an hour ago had completely evaporated. She stared out at Elias, her eyes wide with sudden, unmasked panic, her mind visibly scrambling for a plausible lifeline that simply did not exist, the timeline displayed on that slide. Simone stammered, her voice suddenly thin, reedy, and entirely stripped of its amplified resonance. "That is merely a preliminary graphical representation. The final dates are currently being double-checked in the final version of the manuscript, a final version that has already been submitted for formal peer review," Elias countered instantly, his voice cracking like a whip across the room, offering absolutely no quarter. "The clinical data is completely sound," Simone insisted, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned into the microphone. "We are simply verifying the administrative timestamps internally." It was a devastatingly weak, pathetic defense. Every single physician and researcher sitting in that massive ballroom knew the brutal truth. Administrative timestamps were not something you casually approximated for a national keynote. You either had ethical clearance to touch a patient, or you did not. You either had real, breathing human beings in your study, or you were manufacturing ghosts to secure your funding. For the first time in my professional life, I watched the untouchable director of research begin to suffocate under the weight of her own arrogance. The satisfying crash of Dr. Simone Hart's downfall did not happen. Instead of a dramatic confession or a fiery expulsion from the stage, the massive wheels of academic bureaucracy ground the moment to a sudden, anticlimactic halt. The conference organizers, utterly terrified of a public legal spectacle ruining their flagship event, rushed the podium. A nervous official in a sharply tailored suit grabbed a spare microphone and loudly announced that the current session was temporarily suspended pending an internal review of a documented authorship dispute. He smiled a tight, panicked smile and practically begged the audience to clear the hall for an unscheduled afternoon coffee break. Just like that, the air was violently led out of the room. The devastating momentum Elias had built was neatly boxed up and shoved into an administrative drawer. Simone did not flee the stage in disgrace. That was her terrifying genius. As the crowd shuffled toward the heavy wooden doors, she remained anchored near the center display, immediately surrounding herself with a protective cluster of senior board members and prominent financial sponsors. I watched from the shadows of the back row as she flawlessly slipped into the role of the aggrieved, infinitely patient mentor. She shook her head with an expertly crafted expression of weary sadness. She was speaking in hushed, sympathetic tones, but the narrative she was spinning was loud and clear. She was telling the most powerful people in our industry that I was a brilliant but deeply troubled junior researcher who had simply snapped under the immense pressure of the national spotlight. She framed my departure from the stage not as a reaction to her blatant theft, but as an emotional breakdown over a misunderstood publication credit. By the time Elias and I retreated to a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the main escalators, the institutional damage was already metastasizing. The internal networking application for the medical conference was overflowing with rapid push notifications. A shaky cell phone video of me unplugging my laptop and fleeing the stage had gone entirely viral within our insulated professional bubble. To anyone lacking the context of the raw statistical fraud, the short clip looked exactly as Simone had described it. It looked like a young, overly ambitious physician throwing a thoroughly unprofessional tantrum. I saw 3 senior residents from my own hospital walking toward the escalators. When they made eye contact with me, they abruptly changed direction, practically sprinting toward the opposite concourse to avoid being seen breathing the same air as the radioactive pariah. Then, my phone vibrated violently against my palm. The caller identification displayed the main executive switchboard for the Halcyon Women's Institute. I answered, pressing the speaker tightly against my ear. It was not a colleague offering quiet support. It was the lead counsel for the hospital's corporate legal department. His voice was completely devoid of any humanity, a pure, terrifying manifestation of institutional liability management. He did not ask for my side of the story. He formally reminded me that every single keystroke, every patient chart, and every statistical model I had generated over the past 3 years was the exclusive intellectual property of the Institute. He strongly advised me to refrain from making any further public statements or attempting to access the secure research servers from my hotel room, implicitly threatening my medical license if I dared to contradict the official organizational stance. The psychological warfare escalated rapidly from there. Within 2 hours, a former medical school classmate texted me a screenshot from a private, invite-only group chat. Simone had explicitly deployed her closest academic allies to seed a new, highly destructive narrative. The messages were carefully worded to avoid outright defamation, expressing deep concern for my mental stability. They referenced the grueling night shifts I had worked over the past 12 months, suggesting the chronic sleep deprivation had finally triggered a severe paranoid episode. They were actively transforming my relentless dedication into a symptom of clinical madness. They were building a massive, impenetrable firewall around Simone by completely pathologizing my perfectly rational reaction to her crime. The sheer, suffocating weight of the situation settled heavily onto my chest, making it physically difficult to breathe. I realized I was standing at the absolute most dangerous precipice of the entire ordeal. The truth had not saved me. Having the moral high ground meant absolutely nothing when the enemy controlled the microphone, the corporate legal department, and the whispered conversations in the VIP lounges. Bureaucracy and polite academic procedure were not designed to uncover the truth. They were explicitly designed to protect the institution and its highest earners at all costs. Every single hour the conference organizers spent deliberating behind closed doors was another hour Simone had to quietly log into the main hospital servers back home and systematically scrub the altered data files. She had the power, the administrative access, and the institutional cover to cleanly wipe away the murder weapon while I was trapped 1,000 miles away, effectively gagged by a corporate lawyer. I slumped onto a velvet bench in the alcove, burying my face in my trembling hands. The urge to storm back into the main lobby, grab a megaphone, and scream the truth at the top of my lungs was nearly overpowering. I wanted to tear down the polite facade and force them to look at the fabricated patient timelines. Elias sat down beside me, maintaining a respectful professional distance. He did not offer any empty platitudes or false, patronizing comfort. His demeanor remained as cold and structurally sound as a steel beam. "Do not let the injustice make you stupid, Dr. Bishop," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that immediately cut through my rising panic. "That is exactly what she is praying for. She desperately wants you to act like a hysterical, scorned subordinate because it perfectly validates her fabricated narrative." I looked up, my eyes burning with unshed, furious tears. They are going to let her get away with it. They are forming a committee right now just to protect her funding. Committees are notoriously slow, Elias countered smoothly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the crowd moving through the lobby below us. But digital data is immortal if you know exactly where to strike the killing blow. You are reacting to the theater of the situation. You are fighting a public relations battle that she has been perfecting for 2 decades. You cannot beat her in a hallway whispering campaign. If you want to actually win, you have to completely freeze your emotions right now. We must elevate this from a pathetic departmental dispute over who gets to be first author into a rigorous, heavily documented, mathematically undeniable forensic dossier. We need a weapon so sharp and so legally perilous that the Institute will be forced to amputate her to save themselves. We have a very narrow window before she manages to permanently sanitize the primary servers. He pulled his silver tablet back out of his worn leather briefcase and handed it to me. The screen was glowing brightly in the dim light of the alcove, displaying the raw, unedited code of my original clinical model. "We are entirely done complaining," Elias stated with terrifying finality. "Now, we start digging." The 19th floor suite of the adjacent Grand Hotel felt less like a luxurious retreat and entirely like a secured bunker. We had bypassed the crowded lobby, utilizing a service elevator Elias knew about, and immediately transformed the heavy mahogany dining table into a digital forensics laboratory. The blackout curtains were drawn tightly against the blistering Texas afternoon, plunging the room into cool, artificial shadows. Elias did not waste a single breath on formalities or comforting platitudes. The moment his laptop powered on, he established a heavily encrypted video bridge. The display split seamlessly into 2 distinct feeds. On the left side sat May Hollis. She was an aggressively brilliant, fiercely independent biostatistician operating out of Massachusetts, a woman Elias secretly relied upon whenever a high-profile submission smelled faintly of manufactured perfection. On the right side was a secure, audio-only connection. It belonged to Lena Carver, a veteran clinical research coordinator who had abruptly and quietly resigned her position at the Halcyon Women's Institute exactly 2 years ago. "I transmitted the raw extraction files to both of you exactly 20 minutes ago," Elias announced, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "May, walk us through the architecture." May adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses, leaning close enough to her webcam that the harsh blue light of her monitors illuminated the sharp contours of her face. "You are looking at a masterpiece of absolute, Unadulterated fiction, she stated, her voice crackling crisply through the laptop speakers. Biological data is inherently chaotic. Dr. Bishop, human beings miss their follow-up appointments. Blood samples degrade in the centrifuge, and localized inflammation markers jump unpredictably based on 100 microscopic variables. Your original Phase 1 data accurately reflects that beautiful, frustrating reality. It is authentically messy. She initiated a screen share, flooding our monitors with a series of complex, overlapping scatterplots. But when we transition to Dr. Hart's expanded external validation cohort, that biological messiness miraculously evaporates. May continued, her cursor aggressively circling a cluster of data points. Look at the variance in the leukocyte counts across the 4 rural clinics. The bell curves are impossibly, mathematically symmetrical. The standard deviation across all 350 purported patients in the new subset is a flat, uniform 0.04. You cannot achieve that level of flawless symmetry in a heavily funded, strictly controlled metropolitan laboratory environment, let alone in understaffed, chaotic community clinics. The sample sizes are far too pristine. It looks like a computer-generated ideal rather than a log of living, bleeding patients. The audio feed from Seattle crackled to life. That is exactly because she baked the final file. Lena Carver interjected. Her tone was heavy, laced with a bitter, exhausted familiarity that only comes from surviving a deeply toxic administration. That was her absolute signature maneuver when I worked under her supervision. Whenever a corporate sponsor demanded stronger preliminary results before renewing a multi-million-dollar grant, Simone would commandeer the raw database. She would force the administrative staff to merge dozens of disparate, conflicting data tables into a single, beautifully formatted spreadsheet. She explicitly called it making the numbers palatable for the donors. Lena paused, taking a ragged, audible breath. She deliberately compartmentalized the entire workflow. She never allowed the junior physicians who actually designed and ran the trials to maintain a complete, master copy of the unified records. Once you handed your specific piece of the puzzle over to her, she permanently locked you out of the final administrative tier. If you ever dared to question the sudden, miraculous improvement in the statistical power, you were quietly but ruthlessly pushed off the team. A sickening jolt of recognition hit my stomach. Lena was describing the exact, meticulously laid trap I had walked right into, without saying a word. I pulled my own laptop from my bag. I bypassed the heavily monitored hospital network entirely and logged directly into my personal, encrypted cloud storage vault. I had always harbored a mild paranoia regarding server crashes, an anxiety born from losing a 50-page thesis during my undergraduate years. I rapidly scrolled back through months of backups and pulled up my personal archive from late October. I have the original blueprint, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, entirely stripped of its earlier panic. I opened the master spreadsheet I had manually compiled just hours before Simone officially restricted my administrative access. I turned my screen outward so Elias could see the unvarnished truth. Highlighted in blindingly bright yellow at the top of the external validation tab was a stark, undeniable warning I had typed myself. Cohort size currently sits at 42 valid entries. Statistically insufficient for external validation. Do not publish or deploy. Simone took my genuine, highly cautious foundational research and aggressively pumped it full of unverified, synthetic data, I explained, feeling a cold, clinical detachment washing over me. She desperately needed a massive, groundbreaking sample size to justify a national keynote presentation and secure the commercial funding today. So, she simply invented another 300 patients out of thin air to make the protocol look universally bulletproof to the investors. Actually, she did not invent them entirely out of thin air, May corrected instantly, the rapid, staccato rhythm of her mechanical keyboard echoing sharply in the background. She was far too arrogant to build a synthetic dataset entirely from scratch. She recycled, A newly generated document populated on the shared screen. I just ran a string matching algorithm against the raw patient identification codes hidden deep in her new appendix, May explained, highlighting two specific alphanumeric strings with a bright red digital marker, patient code M492 and patient code K881. I knew I had seen this specific formatting syntax before. I pulled the supplementary data from a massive gestational diabetes study Simone published back in 2021. Those two exact patient codes, right down to the identical admission weights, secondary comorbidities, and exact birth times, exist perfectly intact in that old diabetes trial. She literally copied entire rows of patient data from a 3-year-old study, pasted them directly into your sepsis protocol, and artificially altered the admission dates to make it look like they were evaluated for postpartum infection this past spring. The room descended into a profound, suffocating silence. The low hum of the air conditioning unit suddenly sounded deafening. Elias slowly removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking older and entirely horrified. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual commanding resonance, replaced by a hollow, terrifying realization. "This is no longer a localized matter of stolen authorship," Elias said quietly, staring blankly at the screen. "This is an active, catastrophic threat to public health." I looked at him, the full, crushing weight of his words locking into place in my mind. "She is currently out there leveraging this stolen presentation to fast-track commercial integration," Elias continued, his gaze fixing on the mahogany table. "Medical software companies are actively bidding on this algorithm today. If they push this specific protocol to market, hundreds of mid-level hospitals will enthusiastically adopt it, blindly trusting the peer-reviewed prestige of the Halcyon Women's Institute. But the algorithm's fundamental safety thresholds are currently calibrated on ghost data and recycled diabetes patients. If an exhausted rural triage nurse relies on this falsified model," I said, finishing his thought as a terrifying chill radiated through my bones, "the system will confidently tell her a patient is stable when she is actually crashing. The algorithm will artificially suppress the critical warning signs because the underlying math is a fabricated lie. Real women with raging blood infections will be sent home to die." The stakes of the ordeal shifted instantly. 30 minutes earlier, I had been fighting for my reputation. Now I was staring at evidence that could put real patients at risk. My humiliation no longer mattered. What mattered was stopping a fraudulent protocol from reaching community hospitals. I closed my laptop and looked at Elias. The fear that had followed me out of the ballroom gave way to resolve. We had enough evidence to expose her, but we had to move before the hospital buried it. We were still staring at the damning strings of recycled code on May's shared screen when my secure hospital pager emitted a harsh, singular beep. I glanced down. It was an automated alert from the Halcyon Information Technology Department. My remote administrative privileges had been completely revoked. I grabbed my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I quickly typed in my credentials to access the primary research portal. I needed to verify the access logs. I hit the enter key. A cold gray error message flashed aggressively across the screen. "Access denied. Account suspended pending internal evidence preservation." Simone was moving incredibly fast. She had not even waited for the conference organizers to finish their emergency meeting. She had immediately called the hospital administration in our home state and weaponized the institutional infrastructure against me. Before I could fully process the reality of the server lockout, a new email arrived in my personal inbox. It was from the exact same senior corporate counsel who had called me on the phone less than an hour ago. The subject line was heavily capitalized and terrifyingly sterile. "Formal notice of data handling inquiry." I opened the message, my eyes scanning the dense, threatening legal jargon. The text was meticulously crafted to leave a permanent threat hanging over my career. The lawyer noted that a routine server audit revealed my unique user credentials were the very last to access and download the master statistical files exactly 48 hours prior to the conference. The sheer audacity of the implication was a masterclass in shifting blame. They were actively constructing a fortified paper trail to suggest that I was the one who had manipulated the data. They were preparing a corporate narrative arguing that I had corrupted the files out of blind ambition to ensure a successful trial, and that Dr. Hart had heroically discovered my fraud at the 11th hour. Stepping onto the stage to save the presentation and protect the sacred integrity of the hospital, I read the words aloud to Elias. The blood roared in my ears, drowning out the hum of the hotel air conditioning. I realized with sickening clarity that I was the absolute perfect scapegoat. I was young. I possessed zero institutional power. And thanks to the viral video circulating in the conference lobby of me fleeing the stage in tears, I already looked completely unhinged. I had the perfect manufactured motive. I was a junior doctor desperate for a career-defining win who resorted to cooking the books, only to be caught by her vigilant mentor. And then, right on cue, came the offer that accompanied the threat. My phone vibrated against the table. This time, it was a direct text message from an entirely blocked number. However, the clinical, imperious tone of the message belonged to only one person on Earth. The message outlined a highly confidential, strictly off-the-record proposal. If I agreed to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement by 5 o'clock this evening, and formally submitted a written statement to the ethics board confirming there was absolutely no dispute regarding the integrity of the clinical data, my name would be quietly reinstated on the final journal publication as a secondary co-author. The horrific incident on the auditorium stage would be officially categorized as a simple, unfortunate miscommunication regarding presentation duties due to sheer exhaustion. My job would be secure. My career would technically survive. It was a brilliantly constructed devil's bargain. If I signed that digital document, I would legally legitimize her fraudulent data, permanently tying my name and my medical license to a diagnostic protocol that could literally kill patients in rural wards. If I refused the deal, she would activate the massive legal department, pin the manipulated data entirely on me, and ensure I never practiced medicine anywhere in the country again. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The overwhelming temptation to just surrender, to make the nightmare end and go home, was incredibly heavy. But the immediate thought of those fabricated patient codes being used to triage real, laboring women in understaffed emergency rooms completely eradicated my fear. I deleted the message without typing a single word in reply. I looked across the table at Elias. The legal department is actively framing me for the data manipulation, I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of panic. If we bring May's brilliant statistical analysis to the ethics board right now, Simone will simply claim I manufactured those fake patients myself before I handed the master file over to her yesterday. It immediately becomes a game of my word against hers, and she has a multi-million-dollar legal team backing her narrative. We need something completely physical. We need concrete proof that she premeditated the theft of the presentation itself. Something that completely obliterates her narrative of a last-minute rescue mission, as if the universe itself was actively listening to the sheer desperation in that hotel suite. An email landed in my inbox from an encrypted, non-institutional server address. The sender was listed simply as Noah Pike. I recognized the name immediately. He was the lead audiovisual technician for the convention center, the young man who had nervously helped me clip on my microphone backstage just moments before my world violently imploded. The subject line of the email was entirely blank. The body of the message contained only one hastily typed sentence. I thought you should have this before the management forces me to wipe the local camera servers. Attached to the message was a massive, high-definition video file. My hands shook violently as I clicked the download button. The progress bar crawled agonizingly across the screen, taking nearly 3 full minutes to process the data. Elias leaned over my shoulder, his breathing shallow and focused. The file finally finished downloading. I hit play. The video player opened. displaying a wide-angle security shot of the main convention center auditorium. The massive room was entirely empty, illuminated only by the harsh work lights. The digital timestamp flashing brightly in the bottom right corner of the raw footage read exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. This was a full 4 hours before the conference doors officially opened to the attendees. Standing dead center on the brilliantly lit stage, completely alone in the massive room, was Simone Hart. She was wearing casual morning clothes, holding a paper coffee cup in one hand and my stolen slide deck remote in the other. "Okay, let us run it from the top." Her voice echoed through the empty hall, captured perfectly by the highly sensitive overhead boom microphones. She clicked the remote. My opening slide appeared on the massive screen behind her, and then she began to speak. It was not just that she was merely practicing the presentation. She was actively rehearsing my exact, personal cadence. She was meticulously mimicking the deliberate, heavy pauses I had built into the speech to emphasize the dire mortality rates of rural sepsis. She was practicing the exact emotional inflection I used when detailing my struggles in the emergency room. She was wearing my scientific identity like a stolen coat, adjusting the fit in the mirror before taking it out in public. Then, the footage captured something so incredibly damning that Elias actually gasped out loud in the quiet hotel room. Simone transitioned to the slide detailing our 4 collaborative clinics. She gestured grandly to the screen with her coffee cup. "And as we implemented this protocol at the Oak Haven Regional Medical Center," she began. Before suddenly stumbling over the word, she paused, frowning deeply at the confidence monitor on the floor. "Oak Haven, Oak Ridge. What on earth is this miserable little place called?" she sighed in intense frustration, tapping the remote impatiently against her thigh. "Whatever. I will just say the 3rd rural facility. Nobody actually cares about the names of these dirt road clinics anyway. Let us take it from the top of the slide again." I paused the video, the image of her annoyed face frozen permanently on my screen. A fierce, incredibly triumphant adrenaline surged through my veins, chasing away the last remnants of my exhaustion. The statistical fraud May discovered was the absolute murder weapon, but Simone was currently utilizing her immense power to put my fingerprints all over it. This video, however, was the undeniable, indisputable proof of premeditation. It proved she had not swooped in at the last second to save a disastrous presentation because she suddenly discovered errors in my data. It proved she had stolen my slides, claimed them as her own, and meticulously rehearsed the theft hours before I ever stepped foot into the convention center. She did not even know how to properly pronounce the name of the clinic where I had personally spent 3 months gathering data, definitively proving she had absolutely zero involvement in the actual fieldwork. "This completely shatters her entire fabricated timeline," Elias said, his voice dropping into a deadly, intensely focused register. "She legally claimed she only took over the presentation because of your spontaneous failure on stage. This video emphatically proves she arrived before dawn with the explicit premeditated intention of executing a hostile takeover. It completely destroys the foundation of her legal defense. The crushing walls of her institutional trap were no longer closing in on me. We had just been handed the exact leverage needed to pry the entire mechanism apart. The defensive phase of this nightmare was officially over. We were going on the offensive. The video file from the audio-visual technician was the smoking gun of premeditation. But as we sat in the heavily shadowed hotel room, the true, horrifying scale of the deception began to unfurl before us. Simone Hart was not a rogue actor who had simply succumbed to a moment of desperate ambition. She was the architect of a deeply entrenched, highly efficient manufacturing line of academic fraud, and she absolutely did not operate alone. Elias turned his attention away from the video and began systematically dismantling her publication history. He accessed a restricted editorial database, pulling up every single manuscript Simone had submitted over the past 10 years. His eyes narrowed as he traced the digital breadcrumbs of her career. "Look at this pattern," Elias commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of professional disgust and grim validation. The standard timeline for a rigorous medical manuscript to clear the peer review process is roughly 6 to 8 months. The reviewers demand revisions. The authors adjust the data, and it goes back and forth. But Dr. Hart operates in an entirely different reality. Her last 4 major papers were fully accepted and cleared for publication in under 3 weeks. He highlighted a column of reviewer names across several different studies. She explicitly requests the exact same 3 academic reviewers for every single submission. They are all former colleagues from her fellowship days in Boston. It is a closed, reciprocal validation ring. They rubber stamp her primary manuscripts with zero pushback. Furthermore, she always exploits a specific loophole regarding supplementary statistical files. The dense appendices, where the actual mathematical proof lives, are routinely uploaded mere hours before the final editorial printing deadline. She deliberately creates an administrative bottleneck so nobody has the actual time to run a forensic audit on her numbers before the journal goes to press. The audio feed from Seattle crackled as Lena Carver weighed in, her tone heavy with the exhausted resentment of someone who had tried to blow the whistle and failed. She did not just bend the publishing rules, Lena said smoothly. She actively destroyed the careers of anyone who got close enough to notice the structural rot. When I was the clinical coordinator, there were 2 other highly promising junior physicians who realized their datasets had been artificially inflated just prior to submission. When they attempted to raise the issue quietly within the department, Simone did not argue with them. She simply crushed them administratively. Lena explained that Simone had weaponized the internal hospital review system. She flooded the personnel files of those 2 young doctors with fabricated complaints about their professionalism, their emotional stability, and their lack of collaborative spirit. She effectively poisoned their professional references. One of them left clinical medicine entirely and now works in pharmaceutical sales, Lena revealed. The other one fled across the country to a small private practice in the Pacific Northwest, completely abandoning her promising research career because she was so traumatized by the retaliation. I needed to hear it directly. I opened a new tab, found an old medical alumni directory, and tracked down the private practice number for the doctor who had moved to the Northwest. I stepped into the tiled bathroom of the hotel suite, closing the heavy wooden door to block out the glow of the monitors. I dialed the number, when the receptionist transferred me. The voice on the other end of the line was clipped and intensely guarded, but when I introduced myself and explained the exact nature of the public slaughter I had endured on stage that morning, a long, incredibly heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. When she finally spoke, her voice broke completely. "I thought I was the only one," she whispered, the decades of buried shame and professional trauma suddenly bubbling to the surface. She told me she had spent 5 years believing she was simply not resilient enough for academic medicine, completely unaware that she had been the victim of a calculated, systemic purge. I walked back into the main room, my jaw set. Simone's operation was built on the silent graves of young, brilliant women. But to run an operation this massive for this long, she needed high-level institutional cover. She could not bypass ethical oversight without someone on the inside holding the door open. May's fingers flew across her mechanical keyboard. If she was inventing patients and altering timelines, she had to bypass the Institutional Review Board. May deduced, pulling up the Federal Clinical Trial Registry. Let us look at the ethical compliance signatures for all of her retroactive protocol amendments. Row after row of digital compliance forms flooded the screen. Every single time Simone needed to suddenly expand a patient cohort. Every single time she needed to magically adjust a testing threshold after a trial had already begun. The bureaucratic request was approved with impossible speed, and every single document bore the exact same authorizing signature. Dr. Calvin Reed, I read aloud, the name leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. He was the current chairman of our internal ethics committee. He was the man explicitly tasked with protecting patient safety from overly ambitious researchers. Instead, he was operating as Simone's personal administrative cleaner, fast-tracking her fabricated data through the hospital system without a single question. But the ultimate motive, the true catalyst for this specific, brazen theft, was still missing. Why risk everything to steal my specific sepsis protocol today? I logged into the public financial disclosures for the Halcyon Women's Institute. I scanned the upcoming fiscal projections and the corporate partnership announcements. Then, the final, massive piece of the puzzle locked into place. It is the technology sponsor, I announced, pointing at a press release buried in the corporate relations folder. A massive multinational health software conglomerate had just signed on as the primary financial backer for the institute. According to the internal memos, they were aggressively attempting to commercialize a proprietary, automated early warning software system for maternity wards. They need a flawlessly beautiful, peer-reviewed clinical trial to serve as the foundational marketing material for their new software. Elias realized, his eyes widening in horror. The autumn hospital contracting season begins next month. Billions of dollars in municipal healthcare budgets are up for grabs. Simone is delivering a perfectly packaged, mathematically flawless protocol directly to them, and they are paying her research division handsomely for the privilege. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering, but the true, paralyzing shock arrived 10 minutes later. While digging through the internal hospital network for any further communications regarding the corporate sponsor, I uncovered a highly restricted administrative directive distributed just 48 hours ago. My blood ran completely cold. The letters blurred together for a fraction of a second before the terrifying reality set in. The Halcyon Women's Institute had not waited for the final journal publication. They had already authorized 5 regional satellite hospitals to begin an immediate, live beta test of the algorithmic software, and that software was powered entirely by the preliminary data model Simone had presented on stage. "They are running it right now," I said, my voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "They are actively using her modified thresholds on the floors of those 5 satellite clinics today." If the validation numbers Simone had fabricated were the foundation of that software, the clinical decisions being made at those community hospitals were currently based on a dangerously distorted reality. The algorithm would inevitably look at a laboring mother whose vitals were subtly declining and falsely categorize her as perfectly stable, purely because the synthetic data had artificially raised the safety ceiling. Real women were going to be sent home to face catastrophic systemic infections because a software program built on a lie told a tired nurse not to worry. In that exact moment, every lingering trace of personal grievance, every ounce of wounded pride over my stolen authorship, completely evaporated. I did not care about the title slide anymore. I did not care about the applause I had lost in that auditorium. I was looking at a massive, systemic failure that was about to cost human lives. Simone Hart, Calvin Reed, and the corporate sponsors had built a flawless, heavily armored machine that consumed the labor of junior doctors and spun it into dangerous, commercialized fictions. I looked at Elias, May, and Lena. We possessed the data, we possessed the video, and we knew exactly how the machine worked. My objective was no longer about saving my career or clearing my name. It was entirely about tearing their fraudulent empire down to the bedrock before the sun set on Dallas. Elias severed the encrypted connection on his phone and turned to face the room, the sharp lines of his jaw set in grim anticipation. The conference organizing committee had just declared an emergency. Closed-door administrative plenary for 8 o'clock the following morning, he announced, his voice devoid of any comforting warmth. This was not a standard disciplinary hearing. The guest list included the entire National Ethics Board, the primary corporate technology sponsors, the deans of 3 major medical universities, and 2 senior representatives from the State Medical Licensing Authority. They were convening to quietly and cleanly sever the infected limb of the conference, and Simone was actively steering the blade toward my neck. A sudden, violent urge to burn everything to the ground flared in my chest. I wanted to take the audiovisual technician's rehearsal footage and mass email it to every single attendee registered in the conference directory. I wanted to scream the truth in the hotel lobby. But before I could reach for my laptop to execute a reckless emotional strike, May's voice crackled sharply through the laptop speakers. "Do not even think about hitting send on a raw file." "Dr. Bishop," the statistician warned, reading the dangerous intent in my eyes, "if you dump a fragmented, unverified dossier onto a public server tonight, you will hand Simone the exact procedural loophole she is praying for. She will immediately file an emergency legal injunction claiming you maliciously hacked secure hospital servers, thereby violating federal patient privacy laws. She will successfully pivot the entire narrative away from her own academic fraud and transform herself into the victim of a deranged, vindictive cyber stalking campaign launched by a disgruntled employee. Your evidence will be entirely suppressed in a tidal wave of corporate litigation before the sun even rises." I closed my eyes, forcing the hot, suffocating wave of anger down into a cold, hardened resolve. May was absolutely right. Screaming at the enemy only alerts them to your position. I had to stop acting like an aggrieved victim demanding fairness. I had to operate like an apex predator meticulously setting a trap. "We are not going to fight her with emotion," I stated, opening a completely blank document on my screen. "We are going to bury her in an avalanche of undeniable, sequentially locked forensic bureaucracy." The next 9 hours dissolved into a blur of relentless, hyper-focused execution. I did not sleep. I barely blinked, while the rest of the medical convention attended lavish networking banquets downtown. Our hotel suite operated like a wartime command bunker. I spent the entire night constructing an ironclad, minute-by-minute chronological timeline. I cross-referenced the digital timestamps from my personal cloud backups with the hospital server access logs, securely anchoring them to the exact hour Simone demanded the final files. I layered the audiovisual technician's rehearsal video over the corporate legal emails, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the theft was orchestrated hours before her fabricated narrative of a spontaneous intervention. But a timeline alone was merely circumstantial, without ground truth. I needed a human voice to shatter the illusion of her synthetic dataset. At exactly 11 o'clock at night, I bypassed the formal hospital communication channels and dialed the personal cell phone number of the head triage nurse stationed at the 3rd Collaborative Facility, the tiny rural clinic I had visited countless times. The nurse answered, sounding exhausted from a long shift. When I asked her to verbally confirm the total number of patients they had successfully enrolled in the trial during the spring quarter, her answer was immediate and definitive. They had processed exactly 14 women. She explicitly confirmed they had never even possessed the physical testing kits required to evaluate the hundreds of ghost patients Simone had proudly displayed on the main stage. I secured her absolute willingness to remain on standby for a secure video link the following morning. Next, I needed to preemptively defend the integrity of the original, uncorrupted algorithm, to prove that my actual science was sound before Simone poisoned it. I reached out to a woman who had participated in our very first observational cohort nearly 18 months ago. She was a mother who had survived a catastrophic systemic infection purely because my cautious, preliminary protocol had caught her subtle inflammatory markers days before a standard screening would have. After a quiet, deeply emotional conversation, she formally agreed to grant me written, encrypted consent to utilize her fully anonymized clinical progression chart. Her authentic medical file would serve as the ultimate baseline of truth, proving that the genuine protocol saved lives, while the fabricated, accelerated version was a lethal fiction. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the edges of the blackout curtains, Elias received a frantic, back-channel text message from a trusted colleague sitting on the ethics board. Simone had just launched her final preemptive nuclear strike. She had officially filed a formal grievance with the licensing authority, alleging that I had deliberately leaked proprietary, highly sensitive research data to unauthorized third parties in a desperate act of career sabotage. It was a calculated, lethal accusation. In the medical field, unauthorized data distribution is a cardinal sin that results in the immediate, permanent revocation of a medical license. She was trying to legally execute me before I could even walk into the room. 24 hours ago, that threat would have sent me into a paralyzing spiral of panic. Today, it barely registered on my pulse. Let her file whatever she wants, I said, not lifting my eyes from the final formatting of the document. I turned my laptop toward Elias. He stared at the screen, a slow, deeply satisfied nod confirming the lethality of our work. I had not drafted a passionate manifesto or a tearful plea for justice. I had asked Elias to help me format the entire compilation of evidence according to the impossibly strict, unforgiving submission standards of his own prestigious journal. It contained a formal introduction, a rigorous methodology section detailing our digital forensic extraction, an irrefutable results section highlighting the cloned patient codes and chronological impossibilities, and a devastatingly clinical conclusion. It was a bulletproof academic autopsy of Simone Hart's entire career. The digital clock on the bedside table flipped to 7 in the morning. The time for preparation had expired. I stood up and walked into the bathroom to change into my formal presentation suit. As I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back at me was fundamentally altered. The terrified, humiliated junior doctor who had fled the auditorium stage yesterday was completely gone, burned away by the sheer crucible of the night. In her place stood a deeply calm, strategically lethal investigator who fully comprehended the mechanics of institutional power. Elias packed the encrypted tablet into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, final click. We walked out of the hotel suite and rode the elevator down in absolute silence. We crossed the bustling street, navigating through the early morning crowds of doctors grabbing coffee, and approached the heavy, frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. I did not feel a single ounce of fear as I reached out to grasp the brass handle. I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of that door. And more importantly, I knew exactly when to pull the final curtain down on the performance. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom closed behind Elias and me with a decisive, airtight thud. The expansive room was already packed. The conference organizers sat rigidly at the head of the long oak table, flanked by the senior corporate attorneys from the Halcyon Women's Institute, 3 deans from prominent medical universities, and 2 stone-faced representatives from the State Medical Licensing Board. This was not a mediation. It was a tribunal. Simone walked into the room exactly 2 minutes later. She looked immaculate, wearing a tailored navy suit and projecting an aura of weary patience. She took her seat, completely convinced she was about to skillfully navigate a minor human resources issue, framing the entire disaster as a petty authorship dispute caused by an emotionally unstable junior employee. Elias did not even wait for the committee chairman to formally open the proceedings. He stepped directly to the head of the table, connected his encrypted tablet to the main projector, and launched the first strike. He did not just show the 2 identical manuscripts. The room was already bracing for a plagiarism debate. Instead, Elias bypassed the text entirely and opened the hidden metadata of Simone's submission. He projected the digital footprint of her statistical appendix onto the massive screen. The logs clearly proved that Simone had manually opened and fundamentally altered the raw numerical cells 57 separate times within the final 3 days before the publishing deadline, before Simone could dismiss the edits as standard formatting adjustments. The secure video feed on the secondary monitor flared to life. May Hollis stared down at the board members. She walked them through the impossible mathematical symmetry of the external validation cohort. She demonstrated, with razor-sharp clarity, that the probability of biological data looking that perfect in a rural clinic setting was virtually 0. She then dropped the hammer, highlighting the exact timestamps showing patients were purportedly admitted and tested weeks before the Institutional Review Board had even generated a legal clearance code for that facility. Simone's benevolent mask finally began to slip. She gripped her pen tightly, her eyes darting toward the hospital lawyers. "It is a clerical syncing error within the centralized database," she countered, her voice sharp. "I am not a software engineer. I relied on the data provided to me by my subordinates. That was my cue. I stepped out from the shadows of the back wall and walked directly to the projector. I did not yell. I did not accuse. I simply played the video Noah Pike had sent me. The room fell into an absolute, breathless silence as they watched Simone standing alone on the main stage at 6 o'clock in the morning, holding a coffee cup, meticulously rehearsing my exact speech, mimicking my personal cadence, and cursing out loud because she could not pronounce the name of the very clinic she claimed to have spearheaded. I immediately followed the video with the hospital server access logs, proving she had copied the foundational file directly from my personal restricted folder mere seconds after demanding a final compliance check. It was premeditated theft, captured in high definition. But the final, fatal blow came from the third witness. I established a direct audio connection to the head triage nurse at the Rural Collaborative Center. The board members listened in horrifying realization, as the veteran nurse clearly and unequivocally confirmed they had only ever enrolled 14 women in the trial, entirely exposing the hundreds of perfectly healthy patients in Simone's presentation as complete fabrications. The nurse then added a devastating footnote, revealing that Simone's office had repeatedly pressured their clinic administrators to sign blank supplementary confirmation forms for data that never physically existed. Cornered, desperate, and watching her empire crumble in real time, Simone lashed out. She stood up, slamming her hands onto the oak table. "She is framing me," Simone shouted, her voice echoing shrilly across the boardroom, completely abandoning her polished demeanor. She manipulated the local servers. She fabricated that video using audio splicing to destroy my reputation. Because I caught her falsifying the early trials, I did not argue with her. I did not engage with the hysteria. I simply picked up the presentation remote, switched the input to my own encrypted drive, and brought up the authentic, unvarnished clinical model. For the next 20 minutes, I commanded the room. I walked the deans, the lawyers, and the licensing representatives through the genuine protocol from start to finish. I explained the precise, messy biological mechanisms of postpartum sepsis. I broke down the chained equations I used to handle missing variables. I answered incredibly complex, granular questions from the infectious disease specialists with a depth of intimate, foundational knowledge that absolutely no one could ever fake. I showed them the anonymized chart of the mother whose life we had saved using the cautious, authentic thresholds. I spoke with the authority of the person who had actually done the work in the dark. When I finally clicked off the projector, the verdict in the room was physically palpable. Every single person sitting at that table fully understood the terrifying reality. Simone Hart had not just stolen my slides. She had constructed a massive, lethal fiction, leveraging her powerful academic network and the intense pressure of corporate sponsorship to push a critically untested medical protocol into active hospitals, purely to secure a commercial victory. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. The licensing board representatives informed Simone that her medical license was suspended pending an immediate federal investigation. The hospital lawyers stripped her of all administrative access on the spot and instructed her to leave the premises. The deans confirmed that every single paper she had published over the last decade would undergo a rigorous forensic audit. The corporate sponsor was placed under an emergency ethical review, and Dr. Calvin Reed was forced to immediately resign from every supervisory board he sat on. Simone walked out of the boardroom in complete silence, utterly broken, not by a shouting match, but by the cold, suffocating weight of undeniable proof. Before I left the room, the senior hospital administrators asked me to stay, desperate to salvage their institutional reputation. They officially offered me Simone's vacated position as the director of research. They promised massive funding and immediate publication. I looked at the men who had threatened my career just yesterday. I told them I would not accept the title, nor would I withdraw my external complaints, unless they immediately signed a binding reform package. I demanded mandatory, independent co-author verification for all future submissions. I demanded a protected, third-party whistleblower mechanism so no junior doctor would ever be silenced again. I demanded the creation of a notification fund for any patient impacted by the beta test of the false software. Finally, I demanded a dedicated operational budget to roll out my genuine, functional protocol to the community hospitals that desperately needed it. They had no leverage left. They agreed to every single term. I walked out of the convention center into the bright, blinding Texas sun. I had salvaged my work and protected the women who needed it most. I realized then that the most satisfying revenge is never loud. Sometimes the strongest ending is simply watching the truth close in on the lies your enemies told in front of the very people they wanted to impress. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. And I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Also, please remember to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.